If you're here, you wanted to see this. I'm Vlad and these are his things. Obviously, you all recognize it because this is a very Italian R7090. Many of you who watch me are military or former military, so you've definitely dealt with this thing. They may know perfectly well how to use it and all the little tricks of the trade to make the most of it. But as always, I'm not here to tell you so much about these things as about how this weapon was born, how it works, mechanically speaking, where it comes from. Then, of course, we take it for a little fire test. Italy, as you well know, for many years equipped its own army with the so-called FAL, which in Italy is called FAL Abroad, more famously known as BM-59 from Beretta, an adaptation made on the ME1 Garand to accept 20-round magazines in 308. Winchester 7 62X51 NATO, which was the standard cartridge of the time. A conversion, as much as it was a very successful conversion or adaptation. However, over the years, obviously in the years of the BM-59 project, which is essentially a Garand, which is essentially a weapon that was conceived at the end of the 20s as a project, it makes its presence felt. It's a weapon for many different, in its weight, in its caliber, its general configuration. Quite obsolete. NATO had already adopted at that time the 5.56x45, a very similar derivative, but as you well know, not the same as the 223 Remington. Italy, of course, has lagged a bit in this regard, although there are also other nations that will come to this later. However, it had to adapt to this race to adopt the 556 at Beretta's house in Erano Solution, a solution that had actually been born a long time ago. In fact, because 90 in this 7090, because this 7090 is an adaptation. Then we see exactly what of a weapon already existing in Beretta's house, namely the R70. Also adopted in limited numbers by some units of the Italian army and by some nations abroad. The first one that comes to mind is, for example, Malaysia, at this moment, which had a certain number of Armalite rifle 70S. Actually, the story of this weapon will be very common and very familiar, perhaps to some of our viewers from Italian Switzerland, because this weapon is very, very surprisingly similar to the SIG 540 and 550. It's a coincidence? Absolutely not. Because both rifles, both the Swiss SIGs and the R70 and 7090 consequently, have the same identical genesis. In fact, at the beginning of the 60s, Beretta went to collaborate with the Swiss SIG, specifically for a contract that the Swiss had obtained. The Swiss, in fact, at that time did not have the production capacity to honor a contract they had for the production of the Schweizerische Industriegesellschaft 510. Known to us as the FAS-57, the Sturmgewehr 57, the standard weapon of the Swiss army at that time. A contract for Chile. Chile had ordered these FAS-57 Sturmgewehr 57, and they collaborated with Beretta for the production of these. In fact, there are these very rare Swiss FAS, Swiss Sturmgewehr, marked Beretta because they were produced by Beretta in Italy. Thus, a collaboration between Beretta and Switzerland was born. And this idea of exporting these weapons, having them produced by Beretta for export, continues a bit. There is a series of very interesting prototypes, of which there are only rare photos of, for example, Swiss Sturmgewehr, adapted for the use of the magazine and ammunition of the Kalashnikov. This idea was not very successful. Perhaps the biggest one we can denote is the participation of a series of models. Those that you see in the photo to the tests conducted by the Finnish army, tests that will then be won by the Finnish Velmet. The Swiss, of course, not being in NATO and being neutral, even though obviously historically and culturally tied to the West. They especially have the right to sell their weapons. They do it regularly. And they also want to appeal to a market that, perhaps for ideological reasons, but also logistical ones, uses Kalashnikov or Kalashnikov components like the magazine. So there are these attempts to adapt the Schweizerische Industriegesellschaft 510 to this caliber. There's one thing though, the Schweizerische Industriegesellschaft 510 is a heavy and relatively complicated weapon. They want to make some changes. So they start working on a system that is explicitly similar to the Kalashnikov, but it's similar for export purposes, because they certainly want to make it their own weapon, make it better, superior, but certain components deliberately are reminiscent of the Kalashnikov. So in a certain sense, I wouldn't say it's a derivative, but certainly in terms of components and handling, it can be said to be strongly inspired. Obviously here, the line of what is derived and what is copied and what is merely inspired is very thin. In a certain sense, the R7090 and the 6 Swiss are absurdly, mechanically Kalashnikovs. Another thing that influenced this strange partnership was the fact that at the beginning of the 60s, Beretta wanted to produce Colt's M16s under license, but Colt very bluntly said no. So Beretta had to sort of make do to put a new weapon on the market that didn't actually violate the design and patents around the M16. Initially, what is known as the Schweizerische Industriegesellschaft 530 is developed, or rather what will become the Schweizerische Industriegesellschaft 530. In 1963, only the Italians and Swiss are in disagreement. The Swiss, despite having switched to a long-stroke gas piston system, still want to use the roller locking system. Not much different from what we know from the Krenkoch, even though that is a roller delay. We could say it's more similar to the MG42 in the sense that it has a real closure. The Italians, on the other hand, insist on a rotating head with 2 closure tenons, exactly like in the Kalashnikov. The two can't agree. So the development is actually done separately. Everyone goes back to their own home and everything is done separately. The Italians continue on their own path of the rotating head. The Swiss try to develop this roller system and realize that the Italians were right. So they also go to make a system with a rotating head, what will notoriously become the Schweizerische Industriegesellschaft 540. To our viewers from Switzerland, surely well known. Thus, the R70 was born in 1972. Adoption is quite limited, some departments in Italy, something abroad, in Jordan, in Malaysia. In the 80s, Italy decides that the FAL International Business Machines 59 is starting to become decidedly obsolete. It wants to conform as much as possible to the new NATO standards, equipping the Italian armed forces with a modern assault rifle. The R70 was not in a state to be able to win the competition held by the Italian government. The 7090 therefore had to be adapted to NATO standards. The first thing was to adapt it to the NATO standard magazine, so that everything was obviously compatible with the alliance's standards. The first Armalite rifle, 70, had a magazine that not by chance resembled those of the Kalashnikovs, even though it was in 5.56 NATO or in 2.23. The other major change introduced was the introduction of slide pieces to mount an optic. Or for example, this handle useful for carrying, but which also has integrated night sights. So quite a useful system here. Another thing the R7090 does is put what for me is the most useful accessory on any long gun. I literally love them because bipods are extremely useful. As for the practical use of the weapon, shooting in a practical context at those distances where these weapons are used, the stabilization offered by the bipod, which of course we will test here at Brony, at the Brony shooting range, at 414 Red Barrett. I mean 85 in Turney, this improved weapon is tested along with the Ekla and Koch G41. The VB, a clone of the Galil proposed by Bernardelli and the Finnish Velmet. It will win these trials. What will become and what we know as Armalite Rifle 7090 from the official adoption year, that is 1990. Well, let's move the camera first to see the details of this weapon for those of you in the audience who may not already know them. And then, of course, we go through a nice fire test and move on to the considerations. The 7090 is an assault rifle. This, of course, has been demilitarized, so it no longer has the burst, the automatic mode being also common, because it is demilitarized. Here it has the magazine limited to 5 rounds. It's a very interesting weapon, a fairly heavy weapon, as we have seen. In a sense, it mechanically derives from the Automat Kalashnikov AK. Let's start from the front. Obviously, in front, we have the muzzle. With a flash hider, which is also a device for launching rifle grenades here, you can engage a rifle grenade. We can then turn off the gas by rotating this selector here in this position, so for the launch of grenades without cycling the system. And here, instead, the gas system is active and working. Then we have what is one of my absolute favorite accessories, namely the bipod. In fact, we can simply open the legs of the weapon, which thus remains stable for us. A very convenient thing, especially when we have to shoot from unorthodox positions or from the ground. The added extra stability is definitely not something to underestimate. Going further back, we have the hanger, which obviously allows us to grab the weapon without burning ourselves too much. This is also quite important in the use of the weapon. Then, of course, we reach what is the weapons castle, made in two parts, which separate in a very similar way to the R. I would say that the Beretta 7090, if it does not infringe any M16 patent, as we have seen, they were not able to legally produce.
Speaking and take some things regarding construction, a lot from the R18, which was not from Colt, constructively, so it takes a bit of things from the R18.
We could say even if the design itself of the R70 is quite original as the development together with Schweizerische Industriegesellschaft can be, but it is quite original from Beretta. We have many ambidextrous controls, such as the magazine release. In fact, we can remove the magazine from this position, while on the other side we actually also have a release. In fact, by pressing here, we can also remove the magazine here. We have control of the hold open. The weapon, like every good Western weapon, has a hold open. A very useful thing in my opinion. We have the safety and fire selector. On the armed barrel, we can engage the safety and, in theory, if it wasn't demilitarized. Put the burst. As you see, it does not go beyond the 3-shot burst or the fun mode. Very, very important. The trigger here has a wide access for use with gloves, especially winter ones. You know, Italy has many borders with mountains and many elite alpine troops, so for them, the use in an environment with thick gloves is very important. Above the weapon, we see another of the important features introduced with the 7090. Namely, here we have 1 and 2 rail points, where you can mount this handle and also, for example, an optic. On the other side, we obviously have the bolt handle, which, resuming the discussion of the Kalashnikov, is on the right side. The original R70 is manipulated very similarly to the Kalashnikov. That which is the Schweizerische Industriegesellschaft, even if in another way. But the 7090 also has this small cover, as you well know, once we lower the safety on the Kalashnikov. We have an open space that would allow dirt to enter. Here we have an R7090, this metal plate that moves along with the loading handle. Here we see the shutter open because it goes into hold open. But look at how this cover has moved at this moment to prevent dirt from getting in, trying to make the weapon as reliable as possible. And of course we can't forget the bayonet, an extremely useful accessory in modern warfare, especially in 1990, where it's certainly not an obsolete accessory. Here the weapon's owner tells me something interesting. This bayonet wobbles quite a bit, but it's not a construction defect, because it seems they have slightly milled it. Here is the flash hider, which is that device I was telling you about for launching grenades, so that you can't put grenades on here. The civilian device technically is a grenade launcher. So this, that's why the bayonet wobbles a little bit. We have these two wings with which we can remove it, squeeze it in, and move the bayonet forward. Yes, perhaps more useful here? Maybe our volunteers or soldiers will confirm it? Perhaps more useful for opening food cans than for actual combat. To disassemble the weapon, obviously we have checked that the weapon is unloaded, we have removed the magazine. First of all, we can help ourselves in this whole process with a specific tool, namely a 223 cartridge. We can push in a first pin that allows us to, once removed, separate the upper from the lower. In this way, we can take a look at the trigger mechanism. We can appreciate, for example, elements like the old open, which, by the way, is practically identical to those of the R. Not surprisingly, since it uses the same magazine. And the old open depends a lot on the same magazine. It's quite normal that it's identical. To remove the bolt now, as a moment, the disassembly is in some ways, more similar to the R. We have to remove the cocking handle, which, by the way, is a component that holds together the bolt carrier with the gas piston.
Again, we use the universal tool.
See this small element where I can insert the tip, the ammunition. I pull it back. Can I then remove this cocking handle that connects these two elements? We rest it here. As you can see, it pops out here. This is the actual gas piston that is pulled in this way, pushed by the gases. And we can go on to pull out the bolt and bolt carrier. That is similar, especially if seen from the front with the Kalashnikovs. They are really surprising and quite obvious. So we end up with the bolt and bolt carrier as in a K. We can rotate the bolt further and pull it out. Interestingly, we have here the firing pin, a bit dangling, actually held by this pin. Here the bolt carrier, even if the external shapes are different. Is the analogy with Automat Kalashnikova systems, or for that matter also with the BM-59 and the Garand, similar? We cannot fail to notice a series of similar elements in these weapons. The same here, the bolt is very, very similar to that of the BM-59, and Garand to the same Kalashnikov as we have seen, are weapons that are all closely related. Obviously, reassembling everything is very simple, just like disassembly. We reinsert the bolt into its port, the bolt into the guide. This, of course, is the closed position. This is the open position. When it's in the open position, we can reinsert it into the weapon, making it slide forward. We can then go on to reinsert lock to connect the bolt port with the gas piston. This time we don't need the tool, but simply we don't need the tool to do it, but it simply goes in. We can thus put the two parts back together. And here we are in Brony, as always, trying out this amazing 7090. We have here the 223. The weapon is chambered in 5.56. The magazine can be inserted. And here, with a movement a bit like the K with the Galil. I managed to do this thing. I find it much more comfortable. Always hold it with the right and manipulate it with the left. The weapon is not unsafe, so we can immediately go to shoot at our target. Obviously, the last shot goes in hold open. What to say? The first impressions? The trigger is typically military, but frankly, it's no worse than many other military triggers. I would say perfectly normal. From this point of view, the weapon is obviously heavy. I have a flashback of when I used the Galil. I have a nice video on the Galil after all, as we said. This weapon went into competition with the Galil for adoption. It's heavy, so in the long run it can be tiring to hold it up. I'm thinking of certain R15S that literally weigh a kilo and a half, but this added weight gives a certain stability. It's a very stable weapon to use. Let's try again. The sights are good. It has a nice diopter, nice, small, clearly visible, with two white lines that help for the quick acquisition. I think it's a very easy weapon to use and to shoot with. Here I would like to point out how the weapon gives off a lot of gas and how the bolt carrier impacts very quickly towards the end of its run. The amount of gas in military weapons is quite normal. That is, despite the weapon being very heavy, it is very, very controllable, and the felt recoil is very light. I'll tell you, I find myself very comfortable with it. If not for this weight issue, not so much for having to hold it, but because it unbalances it quite a bit forward. You can really feel it forward. This weight is quite noticeable. And here I think the bipod comes into play, because the bipod, or rather how it actually supports, in reality most of the time these weapons should be used. So let's try. The bipod will definitely improve things, in my opinion, in this. In this position, the bipod makes you appreciate the weapon more. It's very stable, yet allows for significant movement. It's a bipod that I really like. I, as you know, love this type of accessory. Obviously, in this mode, the weapon practically doesn't move between the fact that it's on the ground and the fact that it's heavy. Thanks to everyone for watching this video. As always, if you appreciate videos like this, well, help me out, because this rifle was provided by a channel enthusiast who offered to let me see it. Consider following the link in the description to support me. On platforms like TV or Patreon, doing these things isn't free. I hope that all of you military, ex-military enthusiasts, or people who come here by chance, like this video. As always, see you next time.